Hey there, gang. Welcome back. Today I'm going to do work on a couple of guitars and we're going to do some setups. The goal here is a little different than most in that I've been given a reference guitar, something to take measurements from, and try and bring the others into line with it, duplicating the setup specs as it were. The idea is to make them all feel the same when you're playing. Dudlow showed up with 3 Nationals here, 2 Triolians, and a Res Electric, which will be familiar to some of you as I made a video about converting it to a flat fingerboard during a refret sometime in the last year. As guitar repair people, when talking with a prospective client about what they want out of their guitar, we sometimes get undefined terms. Someone will say, "I want low action." But what does that mean? What is low? And others are going to be a little more specific about it. They'll say, "I want it as low as it can go without buzzing." And then someone else will come along and say, "I don't care if it buzzes as long as it doesn't come through the amp." Occasionally I'll get people who give me actual measurements. Often we have to take those with a grain of salt though, because their methods for measuring might be different than mine, or they're using borrowed figures they saw online in a forum that are supposedly correct. I think over time, most of us develop an average string action height that we consider normal, based on the guitars we've seen and measured, and what players are comfortable with in our experience. Now that may or may not have anything to do with what a particular guitar is capable of giving us. Some guitars can handle lower action. Another guitar might require a lot of painstaking work to get it to that point, because they're all different. Playing style comes into it. If you want extremely low action, you'd better be prepared to play softly, especially with an acoustic guitar. The physics around exciting a string through plucking it dictates that at a certain point, if you play hard enough, that vibrating envelope of the string intersects with the plane of the frets, and that will cause some degradation in the sound. Could be kind of clicky or quacky sounding as the string sort of just bounces off the tops of the frets, or it could be buzzing. That's more evident in acoustic guitars than electrics because you're not sending the signal somewhere else to produce the noise. It becomes an integral part of what you hear from the instrument. So that's why actions tend to be a little bit higher on acoustics. So there's a balance to be reached too. There really are some people who don't mind sounding bad if it means that they can play super fast. For some people it's the reverse. They need the higher action to get the sound they want. These guitars are from a player who uses slide as a major component in his sound, and he likes it clean. He doesn't want to hear the slide banging on the frets or that raspy stuff that happens. But he also needs it to feel comfortable enough when he's fretting. So you got to hit the sweet spot. It's not always easy. Let's talk about measuring increments again. They really don't matter in relation to this work, except in providing a reliable language to transfer a distance on this guitar to one of the other ones. It doesn't matter if you use metric, imperial, Japanese rin, fractions or decimals of any of those, and I don't care what you think is best. Just use the one you're most comfortable with. If you don't have the ability to think and work in more than one system, that's not my problem. I use at least 3, depending on what's convenient for me at the time. And as far as I've seen, most repair people do exactly that, because converting just becomes second nature. I often talk in 64ths of an inch because that's what's on this machinist's rule I've had forever. It's a useful measurement because it's a distance you can see with the naked eye, and it's also palpable. If you change string height by a 64th of an inch, you will definitely feel it. I could just as easily use 0.5 millimeters, but that distance is considerably larger, and therefore some would say it's less accurate, you know? You could also use one of those micrometer style devices that pinches the string down. I find them a little bit cumbersome, and this is more direct and frankly it's faster. And it does what I need it to do, so I use this most of the time. This wood body Triolian is going to be the reference. I did a setup on this a couple of months back and he really liked it. It felt good to him. At the time I made a new nut for it. Previously someone else had put another one on there. The string spacing was shifted so far over that the treble string was falling off the edge of the board. I tightened up the spacing, but I did what a lot of slide players like and pushed that E string over slightly towards the edge. when they're sliding, it just means that you end up with, you don't have to angle the slide as much to get a clean sound on that high E string, which is what most people are using most of the time. So you see the spacing is normal till you get to the E string. It's moved over about 1/2 millimeter or so. Something funny is definitely going on with the Res Electric. The setup has changed drastically since I worked on it in March. I think the neck has sprung up into seriously high relief, because right now it's sitting at about 10/64 on the bass side. Previously it was at 8. That's not normal, even with seasonal changes. So maybe something's going on with the truss rod. We'll have to look at that. This metal body resonator has got an action that's much more in keeping with what we want. Again, it's got around 8/64 on the bass side. It's slightly higher on the treble though. It's around 8.5. So that can come down a little bit. It's also had a replacement nut at some point, and it looks like the spacing got away from them a little bit. There seems to be some super glue fill in and around the slots, especially this B string. Super glue can work to keep things playable for some time, but it's usually not a permanent solution. So, as I mentioned, on this wood body, the one that we like, the action is about 8/64 on the bass side and around 7 on the treble. Now that would be pretty high for most standard acoustic guitars. That would be unacceptable to a lot of people. However, as I mentioned, when you're doing slide and you're working with a resonator guitar, that's on the high side of average. The relief measured at the 6th fret. Now I normally measure this with the guitar in playing position, but it's easier to see here, is around 8/1000 between the underside of the string and the top of the fret, and I measure that with a feeler gauge. That is what I'd consider kind of normal for one of these guitars, 8/1000. This setup hasn't changed very much in the 2 months since I did it. It can be slightly irritating when you set up two guitars with exactly the same numbers and find that they still feel different in use. Things like scale length, the width and the thickness of the neck, its taper, the nut and saddle spacing, even the height of the fret wire can make a huge difference in the way it feels. So I'm just going to, for giggles, measure these at the nut and compare. Neck relief on the metal body is 7/1000, which is virtually identical. Measuring string spread at this end of the guitar is one of those things I always do in millimeters, for whatever reason. I have no excuse for it. It's just the way I always do it. And this is around 54.5 millimeters. Spacing on the metal body is exactly the same, which is good because there can be quite a bit of variability in terms of string spread on these guitars. Another important measurement to take is the height of the strings over the 1st fret, sometimes called the nut action. And this can have serious consequences in terms of playability. If I know me, this should be around 21/1000. And it is. And it's likely a few thousandths less on the treble side, probably around 17/18,000. Yeah, it's around 18/1000. So that is something to shoot for in the other setups. There's a big difference in nut action on the metal-bodied guitar. There's at least 25/1000 clearance there, and probably closer to 27 or 28. And it's even higher on the treble side. So this means that even with identical action heights and neck relief, this guitar is going to feel more difficult to play than the wood-bodied one, simply because there's more force required to get these strings down to touch the frets in the lower positions. So that's something we can work with here. And it's possible that these slots are so shy of the mark that I can actually file below the level of that super glue fill and clean this all up. We might not have to make a new nut. We'll see. Scratch that. We definitely have to make a new nut, as you're about to see, because the string spacing is quite a bit different. The width of the fingerboard at the nut in this case is approximately 0.100 of an inch wider than in the wood-bodied one. And the string spacing here has been cut wider too. Previous one I had done at 41 millimeters. This is around 43. So that's another thing you'll feel. Extra couple of millimeters. It doesn't seem like much, but you will definitely feel it in the hand. Neck relief on the Res Electric is 25/1000, which is about 3 times what it was when it left the shop last time. So first thing to do is to check that truss rod, make sure it functions. These guitars use an 1/8 inch truss rod adjustment nut, same as you'd find on an American Strat. So that's pretty small and delicate. You have to be careful. The nut width on this is a full 1/8 inch smaller than you'd find on the other ones. This is a 1 3/4 inch nut versus 1 7/8 on the other guitars. So consequently the string spread here has to be smaller as well. This is about 38 millimeters versus the 41 on the others. It's a good idea to back the truss rod off first, just to make sure that it's not hung up on anything. That's back to where we were. Make sure it's in there good and securely. Yeah, there's adjustment. Okay. That is about, I don't know, 20 degrees worth of travel. We'll see what that does. Hey, it took some turning, but I am down to 8 thousandths relief, just like on those other guitars. Still, that gives me some pause for thought, because that was a huge adjustment. It was like 3/4 of a turn, which is massive. It's possible that when I did the refret and removed the radius on the front surface of this fingerboard, that some stress is relieved and the neck bowed forward naturally. The other thing is maybe there's some component in the truss rod that's slipping. Although I didn't feel that. Like, the adjustment was positive. It was exactly as I'd expect. It's just, it was a big adjustment. Now it's interesting, but doing that truss rod adjustment has brought us right back down to where we want to be. 8/64 on the bass, 7 on the treble. And of course, doing all that tuning and detuning, I managed to break a string. But I'm just going to let this sit for a while before I try restringing it. I'm going to give it at least a day just to make sure that that truss rod is in fact holding and that things aren't going terribly, terribly wrong under there. I'll take the nut out of the metal body. A decisive tap or two does the trick. The underside of this nut is very irregular, not what I expect to see. And there's also a shim. Its blazing scarlet splendor obscured from the eyes of the world. I'll mark out the dimensions. As I'm doing this in the darkest hours of the night, I'm not going to take it out to my belt sander and instead use a saw to get rid of the excess. I should invest in one of those miniature model making sanders to keep in the shop here, I suppose. One of these days. I figure it takes me about an hour to make a nice nut. Maybe I could save a few minutes with more automation, but at this point I'm pretty efficient at it. Here I'm marking out the slots with a scalpel. This gives my files a very positive starting place, so the slots don't tend to wander. Also, I've cut down virtually all the excess height, so it doesn't take a lot of time. And again, there's less chance of it getting off course. These are only going to take a few strokes of the file to complete when it's on the guitar. See, I'm about 5 thousandths high. I won't have to spend all day filing. It's looking good, but it's still slightly high on the treble side. I'll have to deepen the saddle slots. Off with the strings. When you've done a number of these, you learn how to keep things moving. If this needed major changes, for instance, I'd be disassembling the pickup so I could push it through the cover plate, but in this case I can work around it. A resonator cone is exceptionally delicate. You have to keep it supported and protect it when you're moving it around. Here's a quick shot of the interior. You can see the support stick. That is an extension of the neck. It goes all the way down to the tail block. Really kind of a fascinating design. I'll put that back to bed and then clean and polish the frets. Dudlow likes these hefty gauge flat top strings, but he bulks them up even further by using an 18 for his high string, for less spring against the slide. It's tuned down a step so there's less tension, and this makes up for that, but I'll tell you, it takes some strong fingers. And finally, there we have it. 2 fraternal twins made as close to identical as I can possibly manage. I'll give them a quick tryout and see how they sound.